Somewhere in the flat, frozen prairie of eastern South Dakota, a door was locked from the outside. The dead of December 2001 had settled over Waterton like a held breath, the kind of cold that turns breath to fog and silence into something thicker, heavier than air. A woman named Pamela Jean Dunn had gone to bed the night of Sunday, December 9th. She had spoken to her mother by telephone at approximately 11 o'clock that evening. She had a dog. She had a purse on her kitchen table. She had prescription medication in the bathroom cabinet, a winter coat hanging by the door, and a ring she wore on her right hand. She had, by every measure, a life she was living. By 7 o'clock the following morning, December 10, 2001, she had not reported for her shift at the Jenkins Living Center, where she worked as a reliable and beloved caregiver. That was the first crack in the silence. Her coworkers called. Her family drove to her apartment. The door was locked. Her car sat undisturbed in the parking lot. Her purse remained on the table exactly where it had been. Pam Dunn was gone. And the question that would haunt the town of Waterton, that would follow her family through 20 years of sleepless nights and unanswered prayers, that would eventually land one man in prison for the rest of his life. That question was not simply where she had gone. The question was, who locked that door? To understand what happened to Pamela Dunn, you must first understand Waterton. It sits in the northeast corner of South Dakota, out where the glacial lakes dot the land like scattered mirrors, and the horizon is so wide and so flat that it feels, on certain mornings, like the edge of the earth. The town of roughly 20,000 people is the kind of place where you know the name of your mechanic, where the waitress at the diner remembers how you take your coffee, and where a woman who fails to show up for work is noticed immediately, because in Waterton, people notice. It is a town built on agriculture and stubbornness, and a particular kind of quiet dignity. The winters are punishing, temperatures that make the bones ache, skis that go gray and stay gray for months at a time. By December, the lakes freeze over and the fields lie bare and brown under a thin skin of snow that the wind reshapes every night. The streets of Waterton in December 2001 were the kind that feel both empty and watched, where any unusual car parked too long, any light left on too late, becomes a fact worthy of mention. Pamela Jean Dunn was 38 years old when she disappeared. She had sandy brown hair and warm brown eyes and a smile that her sister later described as one that could fill a room. She had been born in 1963 and had lived a life that held ordinary joy and ordinary difficulty in equal measure. She was a mother. She was a grandmother. She was the kind of woman who spent her working days tending to the elderly, who drove to the care center each morning with purpose, who was, by all accounts, someone others depended upon. She lived in an apartment in Waterton, a modest place kept neatly. Her sister Deb Tarnowski, whom she had only recently learned was her half-sister, had become one of the people closest to her. Their bond was forged quickly and deeply, the way bonds between people who discover unexpected family often are. They talked regularly. They looked out for each other. Deb would later say that she knew almost immediately when someone was wrong for Pam. She had that instinct. The autumn of 2001 had been complicated for Pam. She had recently ended a relationship with a man named Dave Asmussen, a man from Bemis, a rural community outside Waterton. Asmussen was a car dealer by trade, known to deal in vintage vehicles, a man with a history of legal troubles that included federal convictions for odometer rollback and mail fraud. He and Pam had been involved romantically, and for a time, she had worn an engagement ring he had given her. But something had changed. Pam had sought a protection order against Asmussen, the kind of court document a person files when they are afraid, when they have looked at someone they once loved and understood that the threat was real. The protection order was in place. It was, legally, a wall between them. But walls in December 2001 proved insufficient. The last Sunday of Pam's known life was December 9th. That evening, her telephone had rung multiple times. A friend named Beverly Benson later recalled calling Pam and hearing, in the background, the voice of a man. Pam had explained to Beverly that Dave Asmussen was there, collecting the last of his personal belongings from her apartment. Her voice was calm, according to Beverly, or at least calm enough to suggest everything was under control. At approximately 11 o'clock that night, Pam telephoned her mother, Loretta Hallquist. She told her mother she had received another call from Asmussen that evening, that he had sounded upset, possibly like he had been weeping. She did not sound alarmed. She said good night. That was the last time anyone who loved Pamela Dunn heard her voice. Monday morning came. The Jenkins Living Center waited. 7 o'clock became 8. 8 became 9. The phone was answered. There was no explanation, no call-in, no message. Just the silence that sits where a voice should be. By mid-morning, concern had become alarm. A welfare check was requested. Officers from the Watertown Police Department made their way to Pam's apartment. The outer door was locked. A maintenance worker was summoned to gain entry. When the officers stepped inside, they cataloged what they saw with the precision of people trained to notice what is ordinary and what is not. Her purse was on the table. Her keys were on the counter. Her checkbook was present. Her prescription medication sat in the bathroom untouched. Her winter coat, the coat she would have needed the moment she stepped outside into a South Dakota December, hung by the door. Her dog was in the bedroom, alone and waiting. And one thing was missing, the engagement ring that Asmussen had once placed on her finger, just the ring. The phone cord had been forcibly ripped from the wall. The caller ID box was gone. The swing hung still. The dog waited by the bed. And outside in the frozen parking lot, Pam's car sat untouched beneath the gray December sky. The search began immediately, unfolding with the urgency that a strange disappearance demands. Bloodhounds were brought in by December 12th, 2 days after Pam's absence was first reported. They moved through the apartment, through the parking lot, through the frozen streets. They did what they were trained to do, but the trail, if it existed, was cold or gone or both. The Watertown Police Department, a department serving a community that prided itself on safety, mobilized fully. Investigators fanned outward. Flyers were printed. The community, true to its nature, showed up. Volunteers organized, neighbors talked, churches prayed. A note appeared on the door of Pam's apartment building, written by someone who loved her. It read simply, "Pam, come home." It hung there in the winter air. Days passed and she did not. The investigation quickly narrowed its attention to David Asmussen. He was, after all, the last person known to have been with Pam. He had admitted, eventually, to visiting her apartment that evening. His timeline, however, began to shift almost immediately. In his first conversation with investigators, Asmussen denied having been at Pam's apartment on the night of December 9th. He said he had not seen her that evening. Then, when pressed, when the statement of Beverly Benson was placed against his own, his story changed. He acknowledged he had been there. He said he visited between approximately 6:30 and 8:30 p.m. He told investigators that Pam had explained she no longer wished to be with him, that there had been a brief disagreement followed by reconciliation, and that he had then left in his gray Buick and driven to his trailer in Bamies. He said he had slept the night there and woken early the following morning to drive to Sioux Falls, a considerable distance, to inspect a vintage car for sale. When investigators spoke to his brother, Rick Asmussen, the story frayed further. Rick told investigators that his brother had gone somewhere the morning of December 10th, but the details did not align cleanly with what Dave had told police. The trip to Sioux Falls, the odometer readings, the timing, the purpose of the journey did not add up in the way that innocent stories generally add up. Those who knew him said Asmussen was not a man prone to grief or visible worry. Deputies whispered quietly to one another about the quality of his concern, or the absence of it. When Asmussen appeared at the Waterton Police Department in the days following Pam's disappearance, he did so without being asked. He walked in, and without prompting, began emphatically denying any involvement. You'd think that a guy whose love of his life has gone missing, that he'd be worried about finding her. He was worried about defending himself. He was worried about making excuses. He was worried about everything except finding Pam. Those were the words of Vincent Foley, Codington County State Attorney, reflecting years later on what investigators had observed in those early days. It was a specific kind of wrongness, not dramatic, not screaming, but present. The kind that accumulates detail by detail until it becomes undeniable. The phone records added another layer. In the days before Pam disappeared, Asmussen had placed 26 calls to her cellular number from a phone belonging to his father, calls made over a 12-hour period. 3 voice messages had been left on her answering system. When investigators recovered them, the content was disturbing. Messages full of abusive language, accusations about who she had spent time with, threats that there would be, in his own words, some bad consequences if she had lied to him. She had saved those messages. Whether she kept them for comfort or evidence was unknowable. What was knowable was that they were there when the police arrived. And then there was the question of the caller ID box. Gone. Only that and the ring. Investigators noted each inconsistency methodically. The timeline of Asmussen's movements on December 9th and 10th did not hold together under scrutiny. The vehicles he claimed to have driven, the distances he claimed to have covered, the witnesses he pointed to, all of it contained small fractures that investigators could see but could not yet, in December 2001, transform into a prosecutable case. Because there was no body, there was no scene of a crime they could point to. There was a locked apartment, a missing woman, a frightened dog, a ripped phone cord, and a man who had driven to a police station to declare his innocence before anyone had named him a suspect. By February 2002, investigators had enough to charge Asmussen with stalking, charges rooted in the voice messages, the repeated calls, the violation of the protection order. But the larger case, the one that mattered most to Pam's family and friends, remained just out of reach. By the spring of 2002, the immediate, urgent phase of the investigation had quieted. The searches had yielded nothing. The media attention had dimmed. The flyers had faded. The case file grew thicker, not with answers but with questions that no one had been able to answer. In the parking lot outside her apartment, the space where Pam's car had sat remained. The dog had been taken in by family. The note on the door had been taken down, but the case had not closed. It had only gone cold. Time moves differently when someone you love is missing. It does not move forward cleanly the way it does for the rest of the world. It circles. It doubles back. It insists on returning again and again to the last known moment, to a telephone call at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, to a voice that said good night, to the particular silence that followed. For Deb Tarnowski, Pam's half-sister, the months after December 2001 were a kind of suspension. She had lost a sister she had only recently found. She had lost a woman who had become one of the most important people in her life in a compressed, urgent way that only happens when family is discovered late. And she had been left with a certainty she could not prove and a grief that had no proper name. because Pam had not died, not officially, not legally, not in any way that came with a funeral or a grave or the ordinary structures of loss. "You know, 20 years is too long," Deb would say in a 2021 interview, her voice measured and tired in the way of someone who has said a version of these words 1,000 times. Without answers, without closure. That's all that we want. Somebody out there knows and can let somebody know where she is. That's all we want. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have noticed a small wrong thing and told yourself it was nothing, who have seen something in a person's eyes that was not right and found a reason to look away, the Pam Dunn case offers a haunting mirror. The people who loved her had not been wrong. Their instincts had been correct. The trouble was that instinct, however accurate, is not evidence. Dave Asmussen lived with the awareness that investigators were watching him. The stalking charges had proceeded through the courts. In August 2004, a jury in Huron, South Dakota, deliberated for 12 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty. 12 minutes. The kind of deliberation that tells you the jury had very little to discuss, because the facts were that clear. Asmussen was convicted on the stalking counts and sentenced to 40 months in prison. He went to prison, and Codington County State Attorney Vincent Foley began preparing what would come next. The strategy was deliberate, patient, the kind of legal architecture that is built over years rather than weeks. The stalking conviction would put Asmussen behind bars. The time in prison would give investigators the space to build the more complicated case. The case for what had really happened to Pam. The goal was to get him locked up and then proceed to work the bigger case. And we were able to do that. That was Foley, explaining the approach. It is the kind of legal strategy that requires confidence that the evidence, gathered patiently and thoroughly, will eventually tell enough of the story to convince 12 strangers in a jury box. It is also the kind of strategy that requires investigators to sit with an incomplete truth and resist the pressure to settle for less than justice. In the years between Pam's disappearance and Asmussen's stalking conviction, her family continued to hold vigil in the ways available to them. Billboards were erected in Waterton. One, placed to mark what would have been Pam's 50th birthday, bore her photograph and her name and the simple, unanswerable fact of her absence. People drove past it every day. People who had known her and people who hadn't. The billboard was a reminder that the question remained open. The Jenkins Living Center, where Pam had worked, held her memory in the quiet way that workplaces do, in the absence of a familiar face at a familiar time, in the habits of colleagues who had known her routines. Lauren Diekman, who had been president and CEO of the center, accepted a painting donated in her memory. These small, tender monuments are what communities build when the official structures of law have not yet delivered resolution. December would come each year and the temperature would fall and the lakes would freeze and the streets of Waterton would grow quiet and gray. And somewhere in that annual repetition, the people who loved Pam Dunn would mark another year without her. The dog had grown old. The apartment had been rented to someone else. But the absence had not been filled. Inside the prison walls where Asmussen served his stalking sentence, the larger case was being assembled piece by piece. Investigators had gone back to the beginning. They had reconstructed the timeline of December 9th and 10th with a precision that the initial frantic investigation had not allowed. They had measured the odometer discrepancies. They had interviewed witnesses again, this time with years of distance that had, in some cases, loosened things that had been held tight. When Asmussen was approaching the end of his stalking sentence and preparing for parole, prosecutors made their move. They charged him with 2 counts of kidnapping. The first alleged that on or about December 9th, 2001, he had taken Pam against her will to facilitate assault or stalking. The second alleged that he had kidnapped her to harm or terrorize her. The charges were filed just as Asmussen was preparing to walk out of prison. He would not walk out. The kidnapping trial of David Asmussen began in the autumn of 2006, 5 years after Pamela Dunn had last been seen. It was held in Watertown, in Codington County, in the courthouse of the community that had watched this case unfold in slow and painful degrees. The trial lasted 2 days. What made the trial remarkable, beyond the gravity of its subject matter, was the behavior of the defendant. Asmussen had been granted the right to represent himself, then subjected to a mental evaluation after a judge grew concerned about the coherence of that choice. An attorney was eventually appointed, but throughout the proceedings, Asmussen remained almost entirely silent. He offered no opening statement. He declined to cross-examine any of the witnesses the state brought forward. He sat at the defense table and watched, largely expressionless, as the case against him was built in open court. The state's case was meticulous. Prosecutors laid out the timeline of December 9th and 10th in precise detail. They presented the phone records at 26 calls, 12 hours, 3 voice messages, and allowed the jury to draw their own conclusions about what that pattern of communication represented. They presented the evidence from inside Pam's apartment: the forcibly ripped phone cord, the missing caller ID box, the winter coat that remained untouched. They presented the testimony of Beverly Benson, who had heard a male voice in the background during her call with Pam that Sunday evening. They presented the testimony of Loretta Hallquist, Pam's mother, who had spoken to her daughter at 11 o'clock and heard nothing that suggested she was in danger. They presented the inconsistencies in Asmussen's own statements: the initial denial that he had been at Pam's apartment at all, the subsequent revision, the story of the early morning drive to Sioux Falls that did not hold together when measured against the physical realities of distance and time. They presented his prior criminal history, including federal convictions for odometer fraud, a specific kind of deception built around falsifying numbers, around making things appear to be what they are not. And they presented, as perhaps the most telling piece of evidence, Asmussen's own behavior in the days after Pam's disappearance. The fact that he had walked into the Watertown Police Department unsolicited and declared his innocence before being named a suspect. The fact that, when told by a mutual acquaintance that Pam was missing, he had not once picked up the phone to call her family, to call her sister, to call her mother. The man who had placed 26 calls to Pam over a single 12-hour period made no calls at all once she was gone. His phone, in the records, went silent in a way that spoke as loudly as any witness. On top of all of this, phone records indicated Dave Asmussen never attempted to reach Dunn again after the evening of December 9th, 2001. Even after a friend informed him she was missing, he never called to check in on her. He never called her family members. His incessant phone calls stopped. Without a body, without, legally speaking, a confirmed scene of a crime that could be examined for forensic evidence in the traditional sense, prosecutors were asking a jury to reason from circumstance. It was a bold case to bring, and everyone in that Watertown courtroom understood its weight. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. On December 12, 2006, 5 years and 3 days after Pam was last seen, they returned with a verdict: guilty. David Asmussen had kidnapped Pamela Jean Dunn. On January 10, 2007, a judge sentenced David Asmussen to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The community of Watertown received the news the way communities receive verdicts in cases that have become part of their shared story. There was relief for those who had believed. There was grief, too, because a verdict of guilty for kidnapping is not the same as bringing someone home. The conviction named what Asmussen had done. It did not name where Pam was, Her body had never been found. Her family had not been given the closure that a grave allows. Outside the courthouse, people who had known Pam stood in the cold December air, the same kind of cold that had settled over Waterton on the morning she was first found missing, 5 years earlier. Some of them held photographs. The billboard with her face on it still stood somewhere in the town. The note, "Pam, come home," had long since dissolved in the weather, but the words had not. Not everyone found the verdict satisfying in a straightforward way. The absence of a body meant that for some, a small and persistent doubt remained, not about guilt, which the jury had decided, but about the completeness of the story. There were those in the community who had known Asmussen in some peripheral way, who had done business with him, who struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the verdict that now defined him. This is always the way in cases that reach into the fabric of a small town. The lines between neighbors and suspects and strangers are never clean. In 2017, law enforcement received a credible tip that Pam's remains might be located in a well on a rural property in Jewell County, approximately 10 miles north of Clear Lake, roughly 20 miles east of Watertown. Investigators went to the site and conducted a surface-level examination. Inside the well, they recovered a clump of hair. "We did send it out for DNA testing," Watertown Police Captain Chad Stahl said. "Unfortunately, the hair sample was too degraded to get DNA out of, but it did come back and was confirmed as human." Human hair degraded in a well on an abandoned farm in Jewell County. The property, investigators learned, was a place Asmussen had been known to frequent. The abandoned farm site had been decommissioned in the 1980s, the well long disused, the land returned to silence. In November 2020, nearly 19 years after Pam's disappearance, investigators returned to that Jewell County property with heavy equipment and full excavation crews. Task Force 1 members from Sioux Falls Fire Rescue joined with Watertown Fire Rescue personnel. The well, which descended some 21 feet, was excavated to a depth of 29 feet. Special Agent Cam Corey, who had worked the Pam Dunn case for 14 years, told reporters gathered at the site that this was the most promising lead he had encountered in all that time. The excavation took most of a day. When it was complete, investigators had found remains in the section of earth between 25 and 29 feet below the surface. The remains were sent to a forensic laboratory for analysis. The results, in the end, were not what the family had hoped. The materials recovered were primarily animal in nature. Pam Dunn had not been found. Law enforcement will continue the investigation into the disappearance of Pamela Dunn until she is found and can bring the family closure, said Jewell County Sheriff Corey Borg. It was the kind of statement that holds both a promise and a wound. The acknowledgement that the work continues, alongside the acknowledgement that it is not yet finished, that somewhere beneath or within the open landscape of South Dakota, a woman who deserved to be brought home remains unfound. David Asmussen, from his cell in the South Dakota State Penitentiary, has never told investigators where Pam is. He has maintained his silence on that specific question the way he maintained his silence in the courtroom, methodically, deliberately, without apparent remorse. His attorney has sought modifications to his life sentence, arguing on procedural grounds. The courts have continued to consider those filings. Asmussen, as of the most recent reporting, remains imprisoned. Captain Stahl, in statements given over the years, has been direct about where he believes the answer lies. "I would really hope Dave would step up and take ownership in this and come forward with what happened and tell exactly what happened, and let the family know, let us know where Pam is at." He has not. The prairie holds its silence. The case of Pamela Jean Dunn is a study in what justice can accomplish and what it cannot. It can put a man in prison for life. It cannot deliver a daughter back to her mother, or a sister back to a sister who found her too late. It cannot give a body a grave, or a family the particular peace that comes with standing at a marker in the ground and saying, "Here. She was here. She is here." What investigators in Watertown demonstrated over the course of 5 years, and then another 17, is something that deserves recognition. Not because it ended perfectly, because it did not, but because it did not stop. There is a particular kind of patience required to work a case that the world has largely moved on from, to review a file that has grown heavy with years, to drive out to a frozen field in November and tell yourself that this time, this lead, this well on this abandoned property might be the one that brings her home. Special Agent Cam Corey worked the Pam Dunn case for 14 years. Detective Sergeant Chad Stahl has spoken publicly about the case across 2 decades. Vincent Foley built a legal strategy that began with stalking charges and ended with a life sentence. None of them were able to find Pam, but none of them were willing to pretend she didn't matter. For those who have ever loved someone and felt the particular ache of not knowing where they are, not knowing whether they are well, not knowing whether the silence you are living inside is temporary or permanent. The Pam Dunn case will resonate in a way that is difficult to articulate. It is the story of a woman whose instincts were right, who sought protection through the proper channels, who told the truth to her mother at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night and said good night. It is the story of the people who loved her, who drove to her apartment the next morning and found a door locked from outside and a coat still on its hook, and a dog waiting in the bedroom. It is the story of what happens when ordinary legal protections prove insufficient against the specific kind of danger that wears a familiar face. The note on the door of Pam Dunn's apartment building has long since disintegrated. But somewhere in eastern South Dakota, on a flat and frozen landscape where the wind crosses without obstacle, the question it asked has never been answered. "Pam come home,"